Hi everyone, and this is a session on loops and warping in Ableton Live. If you're a beginner for Ableton Live, this will help you very much understand what loops are and how they can be managed within Live, and that's a major part of Ableton. If you're an experienced user, you may not want to have a look at this video, or you may want to just look at it just to see if any of your knowledge can be refreshed, but you should have a pretty decent knowledge of this already, because this is basically the nuts and bolts of Ableton. So let's start. First thing I want to say is, when Ableton came out in the early 2000s, the idea of instant looping and matching to BPM with such accuracy was pretty revolutionary. I mean, there were software systems out there, but none of them worked the way Ableton did, and as accurately and as seamlessly, and in a live setting. So for that reason, it became very popular very quickly. So fast forward 20 years, or just under, we have a situation where pretty much every DAW does looping, and looping types of functionality and very similar functionality to Ableton. But Ableton was definitely the pioneer in this space, and I think they're still the best. I think they still have the best looping functions. So let's get cracking. So what do we mean by looping, and what do we want to do with loops, and why are they important? So let's start with samples. So I think the building blocks for a lot of these Ableton songs are samples, and if you have a look at the left hand side, we've got this area called categories, and Ableton comes with a stock set of samples, and we've got some here, for example. And yeah, these samples can range from drum beats, single shot beats, or piano sounds, or any sound in the world can be a sample. So whoopee-doo, who cares about that? Well, this is very important just to start with, because what we need to know is that there's two types of samples, and I'll show you how Ableton handles those two types of samples. The first type is called a one-shot. So one-shot, let's bring up this acoustic piano. So I'm just going to literally drag the piano into one of these audio slots. Let's put it in there. And the first thing you'll see is when you drag a sample into an audio slot, and what I mean by slot is one of these columns. This is a MIDI column, this is an audio column. And by the way, you can right click and add as many audio columns or MIDI columns as you want. This thing's called return tracks, but we won't worry about that at the moment. So basically so I'll click on this and I'll press delete to get rid of it. So I've got this one here. So the first thing you'll see is this is a sample. It actually has a BPM on that sample because it's written here at 95 BPM. First thing you'll see is when you drag that sample into this track, this column, in the session view of Ableton, which is what you start with when you open Ableton, you can see straight away that the actual global setting, the actual scale, the actual BPM of the song is 95. So it automatically changes the BPM of the entire song. This only happens for the first sample. The subsequent samples I put in, say I put this sample here in, won't change the BPM, it will stay at 95. Okay. To change the BPM of a sample, actually this is a 95 BPM. I'm just going to delete this sample by clicking on it and pressing delete. So let me just see what else we've got here. This one here is 138. Okay, it stays at 95. So basically the first one determines the BPM, the tempo of the entire song. So let's go back to the sample. If I click on the sample, we'll get a lot of information about the sample here on the bottom, and I can expand this screen by just simply waving my mouse here and then dragging this up. There's two elements to the sample. The first one is actually the wave shapes of the sample, and the second one are attributes of the sample. Okay, I'll talk you through them in a second, but let's just hear the sample. So just listen to it. It's pretty slow. I've got the metronome on. I just click the metronome on. I'm going to press space to stop the sample. Okay, so what does this all mean? So basically, this is a loop sample, and the reason it's looped is but automatically every sample you put into Ableton is warped, and then what that means is looped, right? So warp is automatically on. So I'm just going to go to another sample here, which I saved a bit earlier. This is a very basic grand piano sample. Just plays a note. That's actually looped. Okay, I can actually make this sample a bit shorter by waving my mouse here and just dragging this and making the sample clip smaller. So I'll just make it as small as I can actually. Sorry, not that one, this one. So you can hear there that it's being warped, it's being looped. At the end of the sample, it just starts at the beginning again, and I can make it as long as I want. Okay, so that's a loop sample because it's been warped. To make it a one-shot sample, just bring it back down again. I just unclick warp, and let's play it here. Okay, so it stops at the end, but it doesn't repeat. So we'll just, oops, let's just change that again. Let's click on warp and change it again in size. And play it again. Let's play it again, sorry. Just need to move these and press it again. Right, so if I just play that sample again, it's still not looping. That's because we need to click this loop button. Okay, we can change the length in the loop bar by clicking there and clicking that number. I'll click that to 2. Okay, that's actually doubled the length size. I'm going to undo that. I'm going to click, change the 0 here into a 1. All that's done is change the length of the loop. I'm going to change this back to a 0. Give me a sec. Which I can't do because I need to change that to a 1 and change that to a 0. So this is just literally messing around with the loop, and I can start the loop at position 2. Let's see what happens there. So I'm just looping the tail of the because that's a position 2, which is a measure. So it's measure number 2 for this BPM, and it's just literally looping the tail. Okay, so that's really it. So that's the difference between a one shot and a loop. So what else do we have here? So we've got let's look for a beat. Let's look for a beat. So let's remove this loop. Just going to click that and delete it. Going to go to all my samples here. I'm going to now key the word beat in here, which I've already done. And all this does is narrow down the types of loops you're looking for. So let's just randomly select one. That's nice. So I will drag that sample to the right hand side of the column to create a new track automatically with that sample in it. So the first thing you see is that samples, it's got quite a lot of information in there, and each one of these big blobs are beats, basically a kick beat and a snare, and that little thing there is probably a hi-hat, and yeah, so yeah, that's all the information that you want. And you can see also that it's a stereo. Let me just make it bigger. You can see it's a stereo sample because there are two levels here. The top and the bottom level are basically repeated, so that's a stereo signal. If you were going to see a mono signal, you would just see this once. Okay, this is a stereo sound. So we got the piano. We've got the piano in there, and we know that this is a 95 BPM. So to play both of the samples, you have to go here to the master and we look at this number 9, which will play, that play button will play both of the samples at the same time. So let's do that. This is looping, by the way. So the length of this is, so the length of the drum beat is a length of 2. The length of the piano is a bit bigger. It's got a length of 8. So really, this has to go around 4 times to match the one loop that this piano piece is playing. Okay, and it matches perfectly. So that's how 2 loops would match each other. They'll just keep playing and looping, and eventually they hit the end points, right? So 4 times for this one, 1 time for this one. Okay. So what else do we want to show you about the loop? So if we go actually back to the drum loop, we can show you that the original BPM of this loop was 128. Okay, and there's a couple of things we can do. We can make it, if we just click the loop, okay, we can make it slower by clicking this *2 button. So we just made it twice as slow. Let's listen to it. So every time I click on it, it makes it slower by a factor of 2. We can bring it back by clicking this twice. I can make it even faster by clicking the 2 again here. And I can obviously do it this way. So this is the original. Okay, so that's pretty handy to have actually for a producer. And the other thing you can do in the sample box is this one's defaulted to repitch, right? But you can actually, this is the different ways that Ableton would treat your sample. So if we click on beats, it treats it as if it's a beat, okay? So listen to it now. It's quite natural for that, isn't it, to sound like that? But say we're on the piano and we change that to beats, it would sound very unnatural. So let's listen to it. Can't really hear it, maybe because it's such a bare sounding sample, but actually I'm telling you that the best setting is either Complex or Complex Pro. Okay, so if we select repitch, nothing will happen because the original sample is 95 BPM, and that's what the sample of the song is. So let's listen to it. But if we click, we've got repitch selected, and we change the tempo of the song to 120, which is a lot faster. It will sound different. Let's listen. Well, I'm hoping it will sound different. So what it's done is the old-fashioned, if you speed something up, it repitches it and makes it higher. So the beauty of Ableton is that it can keep the pitch of the song even if you make it faster by clicking on the Complex button. Okay? Complex Pro is for pros, I guess. But Complex Pro works in a similar way, but you've got a little bit more control. Okay, you can change the formants. You can change the envelope. But I would just stick to Complex for most people because it still sounds pretty good. The other ones you've got are tones. Okay, listen to tones. It just treats samples as grains, and the bigger the grain size, the more lumpy it sounds. I guess you could use that if you wanted an old-fashioned sounding sample on your song. And then the last one is texture, which is similar, but it's used, maybe I would use it more for things like pads. It just breaks the wave into little small grains. I hardly ever use texture, and I hardly ever use repitch. Tones. I will, from time to time, use repitch on a vocal, which I think could be useful. Complex and Complex Pro are used a lot. Okay, and I use beats for anything that's a beat. Let's stick with Complex. This is sort of game. So it sounds nice. So that's the first thing. That's warp. If there's something not quite right about the tempo, you can tweak it here. Okay. Sometimes Ableton doesn't quite work out the tempo of the song, and you might know that it's a different tempo. I've had that happen with vocals. I've received vocals, and Ableton thinks the vocal's 120, but it's actually 160. If that's the case, you can just type in 160 here, and just press enter. But obviously that's not the case, and I'm going to bring it back to its original. Okay, so that's that. The other part of sample that we want to know about is you can reverse the sample by clicking reverse. Let's do that. Pretty cool. Let's listen to this without the metronome and with the beat. Okay, so that could be useful sometimes. You can save the sample. Actually, I'm not going to do that here. You can actually do something called RAM, which is a sort of put the sample into RAM and make it a higher quality sound. The other thing you can do is increase the size of the waveform, and that will make it louder. Okay, so if you see here, if that edge touches the top, you're clipping. So let's listen to it clipping. Get rid of RAM. Okay, that's clipping. Okay, so your optimal is that, but actually I sometimes like to make them a bit smaller because you want a bit of headroom when you're messing with when you're putting effects and you're maybe wanting to change the sound. Okay, so just something a bit smaller, and it's just worth looking at that sometimes instead of changing the volume. You can always change it back, but yeah, something smaller like that is nice. So this is quite an important thing which I use a lot. So the other thing I don't use much is high quality. I think they're all already very high quality samples. You may want to use high quality. It's up to you. Okay, never used fade before. Let's see what fade does. Let's get to the end of this sample. Okay, I'm going to fail on that one. I don't know what fade is. So, but I'm telling you that I've hardly seen anyone use fade, and I hardly use it. But I'm sure, like everything in Ableton, there's probably a very, very good function for fade. So next thing is transpose. Extremely important, particularly for things like vocals, piano sounds. If you want to produce and mix, if you're mixing songs, transpose becomes extremely useful. So once you have warp on complex, the transpose just literally transposes up a semitone. So let's listen to it. So every time I've selected this and I'm moving it with my up and down on the mouse pad. So 12 is 1 octave, okay? So I guess 12 equals 8 white keyboard steps and 4 black keyboard steps. So it's 12 is an octave. Okay, so if you listen to that, it's quite tinny. Let's repitch it. So that has actually just transposed the song without actually changing the sound. Okay, so that's a very, very useful thing to know. So we'll just unclick warp and listen to it again. Well, so I'm going to double click on this to bring it back to 0. Okay, let's go back to 12. So you can hear the difference. Repitch, warp. Okay, so that's very useful. I'm going to bring it back to complex. So double click that. Detune is something similar, but it's very, very fine tuning the actual. Let's bring the loop back. Very fine tuning the actual sound. You can hear that as I move it up. Okay. So what else do we have here? The other thing you could do is change the color of the clip, which, just change that to blue. You can change the time signature. If you want to make it a waltz and change it to 3/4. As a beginner, I wouldn't touch any of this stuff, to be honest. You can add a groove. So if you click on here, you get the groove tables, and I think I'm not going to do that here. I'm going to do that for the beat. Let's do it for the beat. And I'm going to slow this beat down to 95. Okay, so let's bring a swing groove into this. So I've just selected it. I double click by selecting it, and I select it here. We can look at the groove pool by clicking this thing here, and we can quantize it. We can make it random. We can increase the velocity. You can hear that sort of swing, right? It changes the impact of the sound. Okay, so you can do that. Once you're happy with that, you click commit, and it's actually changes the marker settings, which I'm not going to go into in this video, but it changes the marker settings to keep that sort of groove going. Okay, so that's it for loops. There are other things you can do with the samples, which I'm not going to go into, and they are things like envelope automation. So you can take, if we go to the mixer, we can say look at the panning, and I'm going to be doing this very quickly because that's not the point of this session. I can just change the panning on the loop. Okay, so they can hear the panning now, how it sounds. Okay, so it's just kind of moving it to left and right. Okay, by the way, I'm using the pencil here to do that. If I press Control with the pencil, it smooths out the writing. And so so that's basically it for envelopes for now. I might do a session on envelopes, as it's quite a big area. And I'll unclick the envelopes. So these little things are things that affect the sample. This one's not selected, so let's click on that and see what happens. Okay, this is the trigger for the sample. I'm not going to go into this either. This is really just what triggers the sample, like what are the functions that trigger the sample and when it is triggered. I'm not going to go through that in this session. So that's pretty much it in terms of basics for loops. If you've got any questions or any comments, definitely ask away. I'll be very happy to answer any questions. If you've got any feedback from me, that'll be great. There's obviously things I don't know because I've just shown you that I don't know everything about this, but really I think this is a good starting point for anyone who's interested in playing with loops. Okay, so all the best, and yeah, good luck, and yeah, happy music making. See you later.